Welcome to the Analytics Dynasty podcast. I'm your host Jordan McNamara, and this is the second guest we've had on the podcast, and someone that I've really been excited to talk to. I'm glad he was fortunate to be able to set this up and convince him to come on the podcast. Benjamin Robinson of Grinding the Mocks. How you doing tonight, man?
Doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I just got to say I really enjoy your grinding the mocks, this project that you I think it's a tremendous resource, and for me it's great because you can just at this time of year get inundated with mock drafts and all the media that goes along with it, and it can almost be like distorting of the mind. And so I can always revert back to, I can always just type in grinding the mocks and see sort of where the player's actually at. And then I can I can sort of get a little bit more balance. So you have a great resource.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I feel the same. I used to feel the same way. This project, one of my best friends from college, Blair Douglas, we would, the night of the draft, and you pull up on the couch, fire up the computer, look at the latest Todd McShay mock draft, the latest Mike Mayock mock draft, and you're just kind of getting ready. And one year I went and visited Pittsburgh, and we're watching the draft, and sometimes picks are off. So I'm a Bengals fan, and my friend Blair is a Steelers fan, and so this is the first year that I was thinking about this stuff. I hadn't really started it yet, and the Steelers, they drafted Terrell Edmunds, who's the brother of Tremaine Edmunds, who everyone the first round pick. They both are from Virginia Tech, and they're brothers, and so you see that pick, and yeah, that doesn't feel right. That doesn't feel like a first round pick, and so but the Bengals, they drafted Billy Price, the center from Ohio State that year, and I kind of had my suspicions about it, and so we're sitting on the couch and you say like, oh man, that pick just feels off, or like, that pick, that just seems right about where it should be. And so, it came from a place of, hey, there's what kind of data is there that's out there? Because I'm a data-driven guy. What can we use? What data sources are available to answer these types of questions about, where players' draft stocks are? Because to be honest, draft stock is fake. It's not real, right? I mean, real stocks in real life go up and down, like they're influenced by market factors. And so draft stock, in draft analysts talk about it, fake. It doesn't really exist. I mean, it only really exists if they have a constant updating of their big board and they can account. And so to me, it's like, unless it's something to me, that's how I think. If you are telling me that this is the case, that his draft stock is falling, I can get a sense of that. I trust that some people have, better sources than I do. And so whenever I talk with people who say, my sources say, I say, that's great. I'm glad that you have your sources. I don't, these are my sources. And so, to be honest, the world that I come from is a world of social science research. And in the world of social science research, there's been a lot of work, and people are interested in doing some reading. There's a really great kind of, he's a mix between a political scientist and a psychologist. His name is Philip Tetlock from the University of Pennsylvania. And he's written a bunch of stuff about what he calls super forecasting, looking at kind of how the crowd does in terms of predictor events. And he does it, studies it in the context of international relations quite a bit. And so, when I thought about these mock drafts, I said, there's the research says that more likely than not, the kind of aggregation of forecasts is going to be more accurate in the long term than a single forecast alone. And so, the media, the mock draft media, they're all over the place, and the internet has helped helped me a lot. There's so many mock drafts all over the place. Last year I had 2,000 some mock drafts, and I think that this year I potentially could have even more. So the community is constantly growing, and there's tons of opinions, and they're all over the place. And so, it really helps me, and I'm glad that it helps you too, kind of, find some signal in that noise, because it really is some plays an echo chamber. And so it's really tough to know what's real, what's not real. And so I'm glad that my site, grinding, which is an homage to the online draft community in a way, because none of this data would exist without them and all their work. I'm glad that it kind of is an oasis in the sea of noise of the draft Twitter community. So I'm glad that you find some use out of it, and I'm glad that others do as well.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So I wanted to sort of I want to sort of have you walk through it. How do you go about getting all of these drafts in terms of? I know you have some. They have different degrees of different classifications that you give them, but it's my understanding there's fan mocks. There's a whole variety of mock drafts that you actually put in the data. How do you go about actually getting it?
So yeah, I scraped data. There was a time when I first started this project where, in the first year when I was kind of piloting it, um, I would do some manual data entry or copying and pasting as much as I could. But, over the past couple years, I've automated a bunch of this because, my day job, I'm a data analyst, data scientist. And so, I have professional programming experience. And so I've written kind of some scraping functions that, if you input data from a specific site, can pull that information and pull it together and then pastes it into my database basically. So in terms of where I find these, people say, where do you find all these? Well, Twitter has become pretty helpful. If I have a keyword search on Twitter, and Google, you can get Google updates too. But I tend to, for the most part, Twitter is very helpful, and there's also quite a few sites that aggregate kind of, or mock drafts in terms of host, basically showing most recent updates. So a big one that does, it's a very nice interface, is NFL mock draft database.com. That guy, I think his name is Denny. He does a lot of nice work, just kind of presenting an interface, and it's very well done. But there's also Walter Football, who I think is kind of like in some ways the supposed bad guys in draft Twitter, because they've been around, or even in the online draft community, because they've been around for so long. But they also host a website where they have links of mock drafts that they tend to post, and so I can usually go there, and I tend to kind of just over the course of the week, I'll have a list of mock drafts, and then sometime over the weekend I'll just kind of sit down and hammer them out in a couple hours and get them all scraped and formatted into the spreadsheet, and then do data quality checks and whatnot to make sure that any different spellings of Jeff Okuda or Albert Okwuegbunam, what I'm talking about. So
Yeah.
so there's a lot that goes into that, but the fan, expert, and media classification, it's for the most part, it's pretty subjective. What I do is, if for the most part most people are fans, experts are people who, they are kind of authorities. People look up to them. They work for big major media that don't focus on. So if you're a media member, maybe you write for a newspaper, or in a city that has an NFL team, or you work for an online publication that focuses on the NFL, but maybe not on the draft. And yeah, so that's kind of how I break down fan and media and expert. And the reason I was interested in that was because one of the first questions I had when I started this project was, you know, experts, are they really experts? And so, to be honest, and so I figured, that's probably in some ways worth testing. And so, ultimately, when you do look at the kind of the very basically subjective categorizations that I put together, and I'm always open to people saying that they're not a fan, they're an expert, or that person's not a expert, they're a media member, or vice versa. I'm always open to changing that. I don't think that changes too much around the margins. It wouldn't surprise me if you changed that even a little bit, that those would remain the same. So for the most part, experts do perform better in terms of mock draft accuracy, and that's something that I take into account when I perform my aggregations. It's not just a straight average. Otherwise, I would have my metric. I would call it average draft position. I'd call it ADP. But instead, I call the main metric that I use, I call it expected draft position. And so it's a mix of kind of average draft position, and then we have some weightings that we apply mainly for the prior of the person who made the mock draft, and there's some weightings that are applied for how far the mock draft was made from the day of the draft, because ideally, as time goes on, as we get closer to draft night, the mock draft should be more accurate, and we do see that in the data as well. And then there's all kinds of adjustments that I end up making when it comes to certain positions, because we know that data can be biased. And so one of the things that you need to want to have accurate predictions, because for the most part, there's a famous phrase, all models are wrong, but some models are useful. If you want to have a useful model, and a useful forecast, it requires you to make adjustments. And so one thing that I've noticed in the 2 years of draft results that I have, where I've been doing this project, is that mock drafts tend to overvalue quarterbacks quite a bit. They're the most overvalued position in mock drafts by quite a large amount, and that makes sense, right?
Interesting. In terms
Position
of
on the field in football. Mm-hmm.
So they're overvalued at what point? Like, are they overvalued now, would you say?
I don't know. I couldn't tell you. I haven't looked back and seen over time, does it change? It wouldn't surprise me if leading up to the draft, that shot up. Josh Hermsmeyer from 538, and he used my data last year for an article that he wrote right before the draft and right after the draft. One thing that he noticed was that the players that had the largest change in ADP sample that he used of my data were quarterbacks. So, an example from last year, of a quarterback or two quarterbacks really, who I would categorize as overvalued in mock drafts. One is Drew Lock. He got drafted by the Broncos in the second round. There was a decent amount of chatter that the Broncos would draft him in the first round with their pick. The Broncos, smart decision, took Noah Fant in the first round, who pretty okay rookie year. I think people who drafted Noah Fant should feel okay in their dynasty leagues. But yeah, Drew Lock. There were a lot of people who thought he, very closely tied to the Broncos, and they were right, just around late. And another guy who's, average draft position in that kind of last month or two of the draft process, maybe last month I would say went up quite a bit, was the quarterback that was drafted last year by the Carolina Panthers. I'm blanking on his name. Will Grier, right?
Will Grier.
So yeah, Will Grier last year, was another guy who, people look at his numbers. He was very, very efficient and so I think that there were some teams who were like, well, maybe there's some teams who see something in him, and he ended up going, I think, in the third round. And he was, I think, getting some second round hype a bit in mock drafts, and so for the most part, in the first round, there's something that I've been meaning to do with my process, which is also to kind of norm some of the results to historic draft data. So, for example, this year, big focus on wide receivers because of the historic nature people have been saying of this year's wide receiver draft class. And so people have been saying, this year I've seen, people, I'll say Daniel Jeremiah, for example, has said something like in the first 3 rounds he has, or maybe it was Mel Kiper, as somebody said, that he had 30 wide receivers with first to third round grades, and that's just, to me, it's kind of insane. I have maybe 15 wide receivers that could go in the first 3 rounds, which is great, and that could still change. For to be honest, you do need to kind of norm to a sense of like market share for so to speak, for the round. So for example, quarterbacks last year, I think that was one of the things that I could have done better, which was in the 2018 draft, we had a bumper class of quarterbacks. Darnold, Mayfield, Rosen, Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, and that was a lot. I think that 5th round, and so that was a lot. And in my data, a player that the mock drafts really liked in that group as well was Mason Rudolph, who ended up getting drafted by the Steelers, I think in the second or third round. And so that's a sense of, I think, in some ways, people kind of got a little bit overexcited about the idea of, well, there's a 5th quarterback in there somewhere, and so I'm going to fit in that quarterback. I'm going to make it work. And so for me, I think in my process, I have to make better adjustments when it comes to quarterback, especially some of the other positions that have positions like punter, kicker, fullback. I really don't care about those positions that much, but the high profile positions, quarterback, I want to try to get better with those, especially because it's so valuable. So this year, it's pretty solid so far. I think this year I project maybe four, at most five quarterbacks in the first round. Joe Burrow, Tua Tagovailoa, Justin Herbert, Jordan Love, and there's an outside chance maybe I'm really not a believer at this point about Jacob Eason from Washington could be the fifth. I really don't see it myself in terms of the data. He's kind of borderline first round, but you never know. So I don't want to say that it's impossible because probabilistically it's not. But for me, four quarterbacks in this year for the first round seems like a pretty solid bet that I would be willing to put money down on if I was doing that. So yeah, so there's quite a bit of variation in terms of year to year what those look like, and it can vary, and that'll affect where people go. And so another thing that would be cool to do that I don't have as much time for is a kind of a dynamic model, but that wouldn't really be for anybody but me. Like if last year we had 6 defensive tackles that went in the first round, and so that's going to suppress players' draft stock sometimes quite a bit, but we don't know that coming into the draft night. So it's a fun thing to watch and track, and there's a lot of dynamics going on, and the first round gets a lot of attention, but there's lots of later on by teams and even by players. Like last year, a great example was Terry McLaurin from Ohio State, got drafted by Washington, I think in the third round. And this year for a long time I was tracking the Ohio State receivers, and for a while KJ Hill, the wide receiver from Ohio State, was tracking really closely with Terry McLaurin. And then the combine happened, and Terry McLaurin had a pretty good combine. KJ Hill not so much. So their paths are beginning to diverge. But paying attention to is sometimes the combine, it can be sometimes there's the effects for players that stick, and sometimes they tend to revert back to where they were in the data. So I just wrote a blog post that I posted this week about how the combine affects draft stock. And so a lot of this stuff is kind of I'm interested in because it's sort of horse race material. Everyone views the key moments in the draft process are the end of the college season, the bowl season. That tends to be like prospects' last chance to put tape that against supposedly good competition. It varies quite a bit, but that's supposed to be a line of demarcation. Then there's players, the draft selections that happen, and then we have all-star games, the Senior Bowl, and then you have the combine, and then there's really not a lot. And then we're just kind of coasting until until the draft. So to me, I'm interested as well in some of these horse race sort of things. So I wrote an article, like I said, about the combine, and it turns out that for the most part, the combine just kind of when it comes to players' draft stock in the mock drafts. So there's quite a bit of a normal distribution pretty much when it comes to the players' change in ADP 2 weeks before and 2 weeks after the draft. But if you actually look at that data a little bit closer and you control for players' relative athleticism, maybe some of your listeners have heard of Kent Lee Platty's relative athletic score, and if you kind of look at the high level relative athletic score and you classify those into poor athletes, above average athletes, and elite athletes, players that are above average athletes or average athletes in terms of the combine numbers, and we know that there's a lot of players who don't test at the combine because they're injured or they're elite players and they don't want to concern themselves. They don't want to give people more information to doubt them on. They want people to just kind of think of them in the perfect way that they thought of them coming into the combine. So that number, we know it's not exactly 100% representative of everybody's draft stock, but of the people who participate in the combine, athletes and above average athletes tend to not have that much change. But the players that do end up getting penalized and who do end up getting helped out in terms of mock draft stock are elite athletes. They get rewarded, and for the most part, poor athletes get punished. And so the player that I looked at a little bit more focus in this blog post was DK Metcalf last year, who mock drafts were really high on. So he came in, and in some ways there's an expectation game that because people thought of him as a freak athlete. There were all these pictures that were coming out of him in training, and very impressive, like not going to deny. And so he tended to trend up right before the combine, and then afterward, he tended to kind of continue to do really well, and then eventually came back down to earth, and then his draft selection overall I thought of him as a kind of end of the round, end of first round, mid end of round first round pick, and he ended up going to pick 64 to the Seahawks. And then the other side of the coin is Orlando Brown, Oklahoma in 2018 as well, in 2019 as well. He had one of the worst combines in the history of the combine, and was thought of as a first round pick and ended up going in the third round to the Baltimore Ravens. So yeah, this horse race stuff to me is kind of interesting. At the end of the day, my goal is to have a pretty decent kind of range of outcomes for players when it comes to the draft, because I find that having a mock draft is nice, but it limits you because you only get to say, I think this player is going to go at this point, instead of the real question, which is, it's maybe centered at this point that you're saying, but in reality, every player has, a range of outcomes. And so this project to me helps me think a smarter way about the range of outcomes that a player might have.
So let me ask you about the range of outcomes. For each player, you have basically an expected draft position, or what you call EDP, and then you have a lower limit EDP, and then you have an upper limit EDP. What are those meant to reflect in terms of confidence, in terms of how much, is there a certain confidence percentage there's on those, or sort of what are those meant to reflect?
So yeah, so those are the outputs of, like, it's supposed to represent an interval. I honestly think for a lot of them, sometimes the sample is too large and it ends up centering really closely around certain numbers. I think in the top 10 for the most part, there's not a lot of wiggle room as much as I would like in some of these. So I wouldn't view this as kind of the set in stone probability. I'd rather, if I was going to have a range of outcomes that I would think probabilistically about, I wouldn't use those numbers exactly. But it's kind of a guiding point that I have. At the least I can say, hey, in my, that I'm using right now, in the method, in the player level model that I have, this is where, based on the sample size, based on the mean, based on where the model is kind of fitting the data, this is where we have the center of the distribution, and this is what it looks like on either side. So it's a little confusing for sure. And so, for example, Joe Burrow, he can go anywhere in 1 to 1.5. And so I have rankings as well, where, those are the things that I end up to test my predictions. Those rankings, and those tend to be, for the most part, more accurate relative to the raw expected draft position. But those are supposed to represent, 95% confidence interval from the method that I'm using. But I'm kind of skeptical of them a little bit too. I think it's healthy as an analyst to be skeptical of some of your results. And so I post them because I think I want to give people a range of outcomes, but at the same time, I'm sometimes a little confused by them too, because I think when I look at my data pretty good about, and then I look at Tua Tagovailoa, who I have number 3 in my data, and so there's some expectations in that, because I have him ranked number 3, but his expected draft position is 4, so there's an expectation built in that potentially a team will trade up to 3 and draft him. So, there's that. But then on the low end, I have him going, 3.7 and upper limit 4.4. So do I really think that Tua's draft position is only between, 3.7 and 4.4? 4 could be the average. I feel okay saying that. I don't feel like that's off potentially from what could happen. But I do think that on the lower end, maybe, there's more to be had there. I think his range, if you had to ask, an analyst, if you polled a bunch of different analysts and said, I want to look at the range of where you think players could go from, I would feel a little bit better about that range. But because when you make a mock draft, you're only saying, I predict this, you're not giving a range every single time you do it, then you can do at the moment. And so to me, I think it's good to have some skepticism about these numbers. The range of outcomes, I think, for players that have less mock drafts is a little bit more convincing. So, when you look at some of the draft stock charts that I have on my website, you can look under the pre-draft process and go to draft stock charts. There's, for some of those players that have, fewer mock drafts, you tend to have a much wider level of expected draft position. And I always feel comfortable sometimes looking at those. And so I sometimes feel overly confident in my projections, because in some ways, some of it is kind of self-reinforcing. And so that's why I try to adjust, and I try to do some weighting, and there's more work that I'm trying to do to continue to improve my accuracy and provide a better sense of what the real distribution is. But I find that this is helpful, um, and it's reflective of public information, and mock drafts are, a little slow to react to public data. So, for example, there are always players on the night of the draft where you suddenly hear stuff. So, for example, 2018, projected player was Sam Darnold. Sam Darnold did not go number one, but it came out later in the day that Baker Mayfield went number one. So you can kind of use some common sense and say, that doesn't look right, but ultimately, you can kind of restack the deck a little bit at that point. But last year I had a player in my top 10, and a lot of people did. Jawan Taylor, offensive tackle from Florida, who it was a very good secret apparently because it didn't come out until draft night that he had some injury issue, and so he ended up going to the Jaguars in the second round instead of like the Drew Lock experience that I mentioned earlier. So to me, it's healthy to have a conversation that looks at a range of outcomes. For me on my end, I want to try to do more to make kind of a more realistic range, and so that's something that I'm going to continue to work on. In my spare time when I'm not collecting data, because that's honestly what takes up most of the time with this project. And that's something that I spent a lot of last off season working on was, trying to improve the efficiency of my data collection process. And, this year and then this spending more time on looking at the range of outcomes and improving some of my accuracy. So yeah, it's a good question. I think it's good to move from this player can only go here, this player can go in a range of spots, and let's be smart about how we think about that.
Yeah, no, I like that, and it was interesting because there's I think you exactly hit it on the head. There's I guess at the extremes, it's more, it's very limited in terms of range. But once you get sort of down the board a little bit outside that top 10 or so, you get to see a little bit more range, which I think makes a lot of sense when you sort of when you think about it. How do you have you seen any trends on? I know you talked about the quarterback thing earlier.
Yeah.
For me, like it's the past couple of years, I would say, Baker Mayfield in 2018 in particular. I think Kyler Murray to some extent in 2019, although I think it happened earlier than it did with Baker Mayfield. You got a sense of that they were quote rising, and
Yeah.
that the break came. I think for Mayfield, it came. I mean, in the week of that draft, I mean, I got futures at 10-1 for him to be number one overall. And by the time the draft went, he was, minus 500 or something like that. I mean,
Yeah.
it moved really, really quickly in terms of the betting market. Are there players that we should sort of be on the lookout for? Is there anything we can sort of look at and say, hey, here's a place to sort of monitor, or how do you, with your data, is there any trends there that we can sort of get signal from?
Yeah. One of the things that I've been interested in trying to understand, and this is another project where it's like, well, if I had time, I would look into that. I think there's an interesting social network in the mock drafts. And so let me say what I mean by that. So when I categorize fans and media and experts, one of the reasons if I think you're an expert is because I think people pay attention to you. And so, for example, a guy like Daniel Jeremiah from the NFL Network, he kind of was one of the first people that went, and I don't always read all the mock, but every now and then you see the first 5 picks. And, for the longest time, it was Joe Burrow, Chase Young, Jeff Okuda. And then, after that, there was, Isaiah Simmons, Derek Brown, Justin Herbert. And then you saw Daniel Jeremiah's mock draft one time, and it was Mekhi Becton. And I was like, whoa, I hadn't thought about Mekhi Becton as a first-round pick, or not a first-round, even a first-round pick. I hadn't thought of him at all throughout the process. And so every now and again, there are thought leaders who kind of put their foot down and say, I've been talking to my sources, and they say Mekhi Becton is a guy to watch. And so I think there's an interesting story. There's potentially some interesting research, some network analysis that could look at who are the true opinion leaders. When someone makes a pick on this player, how does it follow? And so, to me, that's something that I'm interested in. For the quarterbacks at the top, each one of them has a different story. For Baker Mayfield, he had some mock drafts throughout. He came into the year with a good pedigree, and there were people saying, "Hey, let's watch this guy." He did really well. He won the Heisman Trophy, and so there was a lot of buzz around him. At the same time, people had this idea of Sam Darnold being number one, and he really, for the most part, was number one throughout the entire process. Kyler Murray, it's hard to say where he was because so many people had just written him off because and so for Joe Burrow, it's kind of more of a Baker Mayfield story, though not as strong of a pedigree coming into the season. And so maybe, people had him as a fourth or fifth round guy. I heard people say. I would guess more like fifth, sixth. So in terms of where to watch players, I'm not 100% sure. I think the combine for when I think of like important positions in fantasy football, it's all on offense. So for running back, a player that I think the combine has a huge influence on positions for certain combine drills, and so I would look to some of the people who've analyzed data and look at how some of those athletic drills get incorporated and athletic numbers really get incorporated in some of the modeling that's done. So Hayden Winks from Roto World has done a really nice job looking at some of the different positions and looking at metrics that matter. Knows that, and he has a very fantasy focus. And so, this year, players that looked really good coming into the combine and didn't look as good coming out were guys like was a player like J.K. and a player who looked decent coming into the combine and looks a lot better coming out of the combine is a guy like Jonathan Taylor, the running back from Wisconsin. So to me, I haven't monitored this as much because the horse race to me is a little more interesting in just terms of storyline stuff. I'm not necessarily following it and seeing it. There's always some interesting stuff in the trend. Not as much to me in the exact raw number of where players are. So for example of a player who's not even in the draft, Travis Etienne from Clemson, declared at the last minute saying he wasn't coming out. And in my data, he had been kind of trending to a sort of a second round status while J.K. Dobbins had been growing. And so to me, that was interesting to say, hey, people watched the college football playoff and they saw J.K. Dobbins have an amazing game against Clemson. They saw Travis Etienne play and they saw him have two pretty good games against Ohio State and LSU respectively, but it didn't move the needle for him as much, and he ended up going back to school because he wants to be a first-round running back, and I respect that. In terms of the receiver, it's really interesting because it's not always 100% sure what the market values. So last year, two players, one I mentioned earlier, DK Metcalf, and I'll mention two others that should be familiar to folks. One, and both of them have decent expectations. One, was AJ Brown from Ole Miss, who ended up getting drafted also in the second round by the Tennessee Titans and had an awesome year. There was the combine. I think it didn't. I'm not sure. I don't think it did much for him. I always thought of him as a first round player, and mock drafts did too. And he ended up going in the second. And another example of a player who I thought had a decent combine as well, and some of the quantitative metrics, Hakeem Butler, wide receiver from Iowa State. So, this year with wide receivers, I think it's a decent bet that you should probably try to draft some of the players that went in the first 3 rounds, just because the depth of the wide receiver position in this year's class, you gotta trust what some of the experts are saying about that, especially people who have been evaluating draft prospects a lot longer than me, because this is only my 3rd year of doing this stuff. But to me, I trust some of the models that guys like Hayden Winks have built, and then also I also follow pretty closely the guys from Pro Football Focus, and I trust that though they're looking at it in terms of a more of like an NFL perspective sometimes than a fantasy perspective. I tend to look at their data as well, and I tend to use those quotes by both quite a lot when I think about, hey, when I see some of those models, I kind of look at my players and how and see how they kind of think about it from an evaluation perspective versus my kind of more valuation based perspective. And so to me, if you're trying to find a player like Terry McLaurin, for the most part, those players don't really. I mean, my guess, just based on success rates, that those players mostly don't exist in later than the 4th round, probably. And I haven't done a whole deep dive on NFL success rates, but it wouldn't surprise me if you saw the the hit rate on wide receivers and maybe looking at like lifetime fan, drops quite precipitously going from round to round. And you might luck in a player that does really well in later than the fourth round, but for the most part, those guys don't last. So, the third round and forward, and this year there should be, like I said, 15 guys. So, in those rookie drafts that are happening, you got to kind of weigh you got to think about it a little differently. Because I think there's going to be a lot of guys who have shots. Going into last year, I remember seeing a lot of stuff pop up in my feed a bit about and how he was thought of really super highly because he had a lot of the metrics that people cared about. Another player to watch this year was Brandon Ayuk, his running mate last year from Arizona State. There are a bunch of players, because you can't draft a wide receiver every pick, and in the draft, teams have lots of different needs, and so there won't be 10 wide receivers. I would think that there's not going to be 10 wide receivers in the first round, but there'll be guys who potentially in other years would be drafted higher because the position, relative scarcity relative to this year where we have a relative surplus when it comes to wide receivers. So this year, it wouldn't surprise me if some of the players that get drafted more into the third round and maybe sometimes even in the early fourth round potentially could be players that are worth targeting. One thing that's different this year is the tight end class versus last year. Tight end class, there's really not an elite guy. Last year, T.J. Hawkinson and Noah Fant were elite guys from Iowa, and there was a pretty decent chance they would both be first round guys, and they did. Hawkinson to the Lions and with elite numbers and elite athleticism, and pretty good numbers, especially for college tight ends. This year there's not that guy. It's a similar deal to Kyler Murray a little bit last year, where Cole Kmet, the tight end from Notre Dame, there was a lot of thought that he wasn't even going to be declaring this year, that he would go back and he was going to play baseball as well. And then he got word that, oh yeah, the tight end class isn't that good this year. That could be good for me. Yeah, he's a projected second round pick out of Notre Dame. And there's a bunch of other tight ends that, for example, World is pretty high on Harrison Bryant from Florida Atlantic, not to be confused with Hunter from Washington, who, Hunter didn't have a super awesome combine. Harrison seemed to, I think, have an okay combine. There's a small school tight end this year as well. 2017, there was Adam Shaheen from Ashland. This year version of that is Adam Troutman from Dayton. The tight end class this year is speaking, and something that I want to do as well is use mock draft data to look at the kind of relative strengths of some of the draft class this year versus last year, and looking kind of at percentiles in terms of the mock draft, like what does the distribution of wide receivers look like? And this year I would expect it to look a lot different than it did in 2018 or it did in 2019. And running back is always a weird position to evaluate. Last year I only thought one player would be a first-round running back, and a lot of people agreed. It's Josh Jacobs, who I think had a pretty good fantasy season. So it's always helpful to kind of think about teams that are going to take a running back in the first round. And last year, the John Gruden, Mike Mayock, if I had to pick it, that was kind of a dead giveaway. And so I didn't get that pick exactly right because for the most part, I thought that the Raiders would use one of their 3 first-round picks on a running back, but I thought it would be the last one because for the most part, my expectation would be that not a lot of teams were going to be thinking about taking a running back in the first round. This year, mock drafts seemed set on the idea that the Kansas City Chiefs are going to take the running back. I don't think that's going to happen based on what I think about the Chiefs, draft history when it comes to running backs. So, this could be a year where once again we have 0 running backs in the first round. That wouldn't surprise me just because there's so many wide receivers, there's quarterbacks, offensive tackle position this year is pretty stacked. There should be at least 4 or 5 first round offensive tackles. And so when you think about that, 4 or 5 quarterbacks plus, 5 offensive tackles plus like 5 or 6, wide receivers plus, Isaiah Simmons and the linebackers that are going to go and the defensive ends and the defensive tackles. To me, I just think that on a numbers game, running backs are kind of the odd position out. And so I suspect there'll be quite a few second round running backs. Like I said, DeAndre Swift, I wouldn't be surprised if he was a first round pick, but I think of him as more of a second round pick. Jonathan Taylor, post-combine, is going to be fun to track. J.K. Dobbins from Ohio State. Those are all players that I think are worth looking at some more on the high end. And, on the low end, it's a little different. When when I think of players that are kind of surprising me when it comes to running back this year, it's let me pull the numbers up real quick while I think about this. Clyde Edwards-Helaire from LSU, Zach Moss from Utah, and Cam Akers from Florida State are also guys that kind of come after that first tier of running backs that I project to be, for the most part, second round picks. But those other running backs are going to be, third, fourth round picks potentially. So yeah, running back class is not as high on the top, but there's like a few pretty strong candidates for second round that I think are decent early impact.
Yeah, it's interesting because
J.K. Dobbins, Jonathan Taylor.
Yeah, it's interesting sort of as I was listening to you talk and you were talking earlier about the defensive linemen and you sort of and something I've picked up on a little bit, I think this year is we've been blessed with really good running back classes in the past like 3 years, and so you're almost at a point where there's not as much demand. So it might, sort of the depth of class, and there's maybe more players that qualify for being top 3 round wide receivers this year, but there's more of a demand for them too. Whereas at like running back, for example, like I think the Jonathan Taylor's case to be a first round pick is really, I think, really good in terms of his overall profile, his overall metrics and athleticism and all of those things, his fundamentals. It just seems like there's a couple of things going on. There's a lot of depth at running back in the NFL already, and it's a deep class. You just basically have, you have a lack of demand and you have a lot of supply. So it's just dropping the cost a little bit. So it's interesting sort of to hear you talk about that with other positions, because that's something I've felt a lot about the running back position this year.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't believe, there's like running backs don't matter. We know in fantasy football matter. It helps a lot to have good running backs in fantasy football. So, I think about it differently sometimes for the different audiences. But yeah, you're right. It's not just that we have the supply demand, issue that you brought up, but also it's about just the knowledge about what matters in the league. And we know that passing is much more efficient than running, and teams that pass well tend to do really well. And when you look at the expected points added per play of the playoff teams this year, almost all of them were really, really good, efficient passers.
Yeah, for
the
sure.
Ravens, the the 49ers, they were also good at running the ball, the 49ers and the Ravens, but they also had sneakily efficient, passing games. And so, I think that not only is the draft a good way to get, it's obviously really the only way that teams can get cheap, these like cheap commodities relative to what they would potentially get on an open market. And I like kind of thank God, because I'm a Bengals fan, and I don't think the Bengals are get a top quarterback is to get lucky in the draft. And this year with Joe Burrow, they've kind of gotten lucky, because I wasn't as excited about Justin Herbert, given when Tua got hurt. But yeah, no, the end of the running back position has been devalued, because for the most part, people realize that a 95th percentile running back versus a 75th percentile running back, theoretically, the difference in actual value for an NFL team, the difference between those two players in terms of winning games doesn't really make a big difference, or doesn't make as much of a difference as you might think. And so the teams like the Tennessee Titans, the emergence of Ryan Tannehill, the emergence of A.J. Brown, helping a lot, pushed them to the playoffs, and then in the playoffs they turned into like this different team, and I kind of wondered where Ryan Tannehill went. But yeah, the running back position, it's a strange thing, and so I think people are learning more and more. So in 2018, I had Darius Geis as a first-round running back, in addition to a bunch of other players. Barkley, obviously, in 2018. I'm trying to think of the first-round running backs from 2018. Sonny Michel, and then another surprise from the 2018 draft, and that kind of makes you reevaluate things quite a bit. So 2018 we had that surprise of Terrell Edmonds that for the Steelers that really changed things a lot. And in 2018, we also had Rashad Penny for all the analytically minded Seahawks fans, totally going insane when Rashad Penny went. He had good production. In college, I really didn't follow his production that much. I just knew that he was well Senior Bowl. Apparently, the Seattle Seahawks are slaves to the Senior Bowl, because In 2018, Rashad Penny goes to the Senior Bowl, and they end up drafting him. Last year, the Seahawks also make kind of a heterodox kind of draft pick with L.J. Collier from TCU, and so for the Seahawks, it's a little hard to pick what guy they're going to go after because in the past couple years they've been pretty heterodox. And when I look at the difference between expected draft position and actual team by team basis, there's some teams that can afford to do stuff like that. The Seahawks are one of those teams because they have Russell Wilson. And so when you have a guy like Russell Wilson, you can make mistakes in the draft and still do really well because he's a top quarterback in the league, and quarterback is so crucial to winning games. And then you also look at teams like that have a difference between quite a big difference between expected draft position and actual draft position. The Cleveland Browns, and so one of those ones is the going number one instead of number four, but we can kind of throw that out. They drafted Ward, the cornerback. They drafted him a bit earlier than expected in 2018, and in 2019, they drafted in the third round a guy named, I think in the third round, Sione Takitaki, which was a linebacker from Brigham Young, a bit earlier than I had thought. But then they also get Greedy Williams in the second round when I thought he was a potential first round pick. So yeah, this like draft surplus value question for teams is really interesting, and it has as much of a relationship with winning games as you might think, because for the most part, if you have quarterback, some of those other picks, you get a little bit more leeway when it comes to missing on a player. Like you can take a first round running back like the Patriots did in 2018 with Sony Michel and win a Super Bowl because for the most part, he's just a guy, and your team was already set up to win a Super Bowl pretty much as it is. But yeah, the Seahawks are a team that tends to be pretty heterodox. The Browns tend to be pretty heterodox. Niners. So these are teams that, the Colts, when you think about teams that, draft in terms of their guys, it shows up in the data a bit too. And so that's more of a post-draft type of thing. Like I can't tell what a team's, expect. I don't have an idea of what a team's, expected draft surplus value is going to be. But yeah, some of those teams, they're well known for having certain processes, and they tend to think about players differently than the rest of the league. And some of them have done really well, regardless of whether they have a good quarterback. It's interesting it's always, kind of interesting to look at the teams that kind of fall at either of the ends. And sometimes the teams that are pretty, for the most part, boring when it comes to draft, they don't tend to draft too many players, different from expected. And those tend to be teams that you would think of like the Bears, the Jets, the Steelers, the Bengals. They tend to draft players around where they're expected, the Rams. And so sometimes, maybe more swings at guys. A team that has done really well with limited draft capital, for me, has been the New Orleans Saints. They've done really well with the draft in terms of the expected draft value versus actual draft value, especially last year. They didn't really even have that many picks because in 2018, they traded up to draft Marcus Davenport, the defensive end from University of Texas, San Antonio. Maybe it was from UTEP, I think. I forget. One of those Texas schools. And so they only had two main picks last year. Eric McCoy in the second round from Texas A&M, borderline first round, second round pick that they got their selection in the second round. And then, they also drafted Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, who a lot of people had in the first round and that ended up being a third or fourth round pick. So it's interesting to see, on either side of the coin, teams that are thought of as, heterodox thinkers, teams that kind of tend to draft players where they kind of are going to be expected to be at, and teams who kind of, tend to get good value. Like, for example, the Tennessee Titans, great value with A.J. Brown. What a great pick. And then in 2018, so 2 drafts ago, Harold Landry, the pass rusher from Boston College. So, Tennessee Titans are a team that, when I look at the draft, I tend to think they get really good value out of the draft. And then a team like the Seahawks, maybe not as much, but because they have the quarterback, they're going to do, better on the field for the most part than the Titans. Although the Titans this year, got pretty lucky, and Ryan Tannehill turned into a completion percentage over expectation king. And so yeah, it's anything can happen. So to me, like I don't from the fantasy football perspective, when I talk to people about how these team numbers look, you can have a draft that's heterodox in fantasy football and still do well if you trust your projection system. I view it from a point of efficiency in terms of your limited resources. So you only have a certain number of picks. So you should try to maximize the efficiency of your picks as much as possible. So just because you have a player who's ranked, 10th overall, if you can get that player ranked 50th over in the 50th spot, that's a huge win for you. And so, that's why I don't think, this draft surplus value is the be all end all, because heterodox thinking can work out in your favor.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. Just to follow up on one thing you said, yeah, he was Marcus Davenport was University of Texas said San Antonio, and the hit rate on wide receivers in day 3, 5%. So
Yeah.
so yeah, you're dead on there. Let me ask you this as one last question to sort of put a bow on this conversation, which I think is great, and I think it's helpful in terms of how to think about these players and how to think about the draft and going forward. Have you had? I mean, I know that there's some game theory or some war games, if you will, of NFL teams sort of plotting out boards and how the draft might fall in terms of who might fall to them and sort of some planning for these sorts of things. Have you had any outreach, or do you know if NFL teams are using your data or any of your resources in terms of whether it's analysis or whether it's using you as a consultant or anything like that in terms of your data?
Uh, yeah. I, so one thing that was really encouraging was, hearing that teams actually do use mock draft data. So I was at the Carnegie Mellon Sports Analytics Conference last year, and then talked with some people from some teams, and they're like, "Yeah, we have models that do this. We look at mock drafts." So and we know anecdotally, so Mike Lombardi, the former front office executive, he's talked about how in the past the teams that he's been at have used mock drafts, sometimes using models and sometimes just using ones that they kind of trust. So there used to be a guy, I don't remember his name. I think he worked in Dallas Morning News or something like that, who put out a mock draft that every year, was like a guiding light. Like he was so like dialed into the pulse of the league that he did a really good job in the first round, and that was helpful to the 49ers being in the right position to draft Jerry Rice. So use this data. I think currently some teams are using this data quite a bit. I know that the analytically smart teams do this to a certain extent. I'm not sure if they're doing it to the sample that I have. And I haven't heard anything from NFL teams as of yet. I think that'd be a pretty cool experience to have. And so, I've done some outreach myself too, but for the most part, you're just kind of trying to publicly kind of promote this type of thinking and talking with people and just thinking about the draft in a more quantitative way. But yeah, mock drafts I think have a place to play. I know teams do, like you said, they do war games. Teams will do scenarios because I think it's good preparation for them to think about it in the moment of, hey, if this thing happens, what does our board look like? Or how do we feel about positional value in this part of the draft? And so I think it's healthy for teams to do that. For me, this helps anchor some of the expectations or some of the biases maybe that people have. So, the NFL teams have scouting departments who have really done like top-notch work, for the most part on evaluating these players, looking to know them personally and their backgrounds and their medical history, and a lot of that stuff we're not privy to. So you kind of got to trust that they have more information than us. But sometimes we also know that sometimes too much information can be overwhelming, and teams can be kind of lose the forest for the trees, when they look at these players. So to me, this data can be helpful, and in some ways from you making what I would call like a stupid pick, like maybe overvaluing a player a lot, unless your evaluation system, has a really, really grade on this guy and you feel very confident about it. So the example that I tend to give are two from last year's draft. One that was a higher pick and the other that was a little bit lower. And so one pick was the quote unquote least valuable pick in terms of just when you adjust for the draft position of the player. When you value the first round picks more valuable than some of the other picks. Clelin Ferrell, the defensive end from Clemson, who was drafted by the Raiders number 4, huge surprise. That's probably one of the least valuable of the past 3 years. And then my Cincinnati Bengals drafted a guy named Drew Sample, the tight end from Washington last year. I think they wanted him to be their Will Disley, and it didn't really work out this year as much. But yeah, to me, I think this helps. When you're thinking about whether you want to make a trade, about where some of these players, what are their range of outcomes. It helps you kind of do a little bit of a check in your thinking. People tend to be really confident in their about that they know it's what. So it comes back to this research from Cade Massey and Richard Thaler. I'm not sure if you've heard about it, about how they look at trades in the draft, and they specifically look at teams that trade up in the draft. And when you trade up in the draft, it usually means that you're trying to get ahead of somebody because you really want that player. And so for the most part, when people trade up, they for the most part end up losing out on that cost benefit analysis. So for the most part, when you look at what teams got and the players they got from those trades, and for the most part, people are overconfident, especially in the front offices, about the quality of the players that they're taking when they trade up. So to me, when I see this tool in the context of an actual NFL team's decision making, I think about it in terms of it's a decision aid. This is not going to tell you which player is better than the other player. You and your team should be figuring that out on your own. But this can maybe give you a sense of that range of outcomes. And it can help you understand, hey, if we feel comfortable about these players and we understand them and we understand the pros and the cons, and we feel good on evaluation, we need to be thinking just as much about player evaluation as we do about player valuation, so that we're not making picks that end up being a less efficient use of our limited resources in the draft. And we know how important hitting on the draft is, because hitting on the draft is, for the most part, mostly luck. And that's because it's a very hard thing to do. So any additional edge you can get in the draft, even if it's a little bit, can go a long ways in improving your performance on game day on the field, because you end up getting the best players that you would like possible point. And so you're not utilizing your draft capital in a poor way. And so teams that have a huge opportunity this year to change the trajectory of their team are teams that have tons of draft capital. So this year it's the Raiders again. What are they going to do? They have 2 first-round picks. They don't have 3 like last year, but they have 2 second-rounders. This year it's the Jacksonville Dolphins and Jaguars, and another team that has a huge chance is the Lions, because they're and the Redskins theoretically, who are in great trade positions. So the draft can be a way that you can turn around your franchise in relatively short order. So those are going to be some teams that I'm following pretty closely, and it should be fun to watch. But yeah, I think it's a cool decision aid. I think it can be really helpful. I know teams are already doing it. And so, potentially for me, I'm trying to reach out to teams that maybe don't have this intelligence as much and are interested in it. So if you're listening, maybe who knows, I'm definitely interested in some of the consulting opportunities that could be out there and being involved in helping out with a team's draft process. I think it'd be pretty cool.
Do you know, just to follow up on that, can you tell us the teams that are doing this? I mean, I would assume the Patriots, but I don't know if you sort of can tell us who's actually doing it.
So I don't know exactly which teams are doing it or not. I know in the past Michael Lombardi has said that the teams that he's been with are doing it. When I think for the most part the teams that you think of are doing it, but I think you need to be a little more optimistic. Actually, I think that it wouldn't surprise me to think that a lot of teams are actually doing this. It's just that teams are so secretive. We don't even know sometimes, how many roles around the league, because they sometimes appear on the team website, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they have like different titles. Like some teams, they call their analysts draft like salary cap analysts, because they analyze the salary cap, but they also do other types of data projects. So I think you'd be surprised. There's teams that are well known for being analytically forward, like the Patriots. The Browns have Paul DePodesta, the Philadelphia Eagles. Those are teams that are the Baltimore Ravens, like I said. Those
the
are
Colts
teams
probably too.
Colts as well. That I think you'd be surprised. It wouldn't surprise me if the Jacksonville Jaguars. The ownership of the Jacksonville Jaguars has ownership in a data analytics company, so it wouldn't surprise me if they were doing some of that stuff as well. Data is currency, and so it doesn't surprise me that with the rise of people who are really involved in business. So, for example, Miami Dolphins are owned by Stephen Ross, who's the University of Michigan's business school is named after him. So it wouldn't surprise me if, people like that are using this data or process. They're data driven and they want their teams to be data driven. So it doesn't surprise me that there are a lot of teams that do this around the league. Probably not everybody, but maybe more than you might think.
Yeah, that's reassuring. Well, Benjamin Robinson, thanks so much for coming on. If you can quickly, give your Twitter handle and plug your site and tell everyone where they can find you.
Sure. So you can find me on Twitter at BENJ_Robinson. And you can find my site at grindingthemox. So it's like grinding the tape, but grindingthemox.com. And it'll redirect you to my app, and you can play around and discover and explore the data.
Yeah, it's a favorite of mine. It's one of my most frequented pages. So I'm probably going there and dive in on some AJ Dillon right now, as a matter of fact. So Benjamin Robinson, thanks so much for joining us. I appreciate your time tonight. And for this episode of the Analytics of Dynasty, you can again find all of the work at grindingthemox.com, and as well as you can go to analyticsdynasty.com. I have a series up now on storylines I'm watching, so you can find that. It's a daily series coming out at analyticsdynasty.com. You can go get the book, Analytics of Dynasty 2020 edition. It's on sale for $30. It's got the hit rates in there as well. So if you're thinking about the cut lines in terms of Benjamin's draft data, you can find the significance of those in the book, as well as the densities and sort of the hit rates on a lot of these guys and all the strategy there. And you can find more premium additional audio content at patreon.com/analyticsdynasty. Until next time, continue embracing the variance, and we will talk